I should have worn my glasses. That's how this whole thing started. I was already late to the funeral, weaving through traffic with one shoe off and my tie askew. My cousin Paul had passed away, heart attack, sudden, 54, and the whole family was gathering at a small church in Pennsylvania. I hadn't seen half of them in years. You know how it is. Weddings and funerals, the unofficial family reunions. I rushed into the church just as the organist hit the last note of Amazing Grace, eyes scanning the pews for a familiar face. That's when I saw him, dark suit, trim beard, standing alone near the back. He looked just like my cousin Danny. I hadn't seen Danny since Aunt Teresa's third wedding, but the resemblance was there. Same build, same quiet intensity. I walked up to him, heart thudding with that strange cocktail of grief and guilt. Danny, I said, voice cracking. It's been too long. He looked surprised for a half second, then smiled, a little awkwardly. Yeah, it really has. And then I hugged him. Like full body, funeral strength hug. The kind where you don't really say anything, you just press grief into another person like it might come out easier that way. He hugged me back. No hesitation. We sat together during the service. He handed me a tissue when the slideshow hit a particularly rough patch. I leaned over during the eulogy and whispered something stupid about Paul's obsession with apple pie and thermostats. He laughed, quietly. When the service ended, I offered to drive him to the reception. He said he'd already called a ride, but thanked me. I gave him my number anyway, just in case. It wasn't until I was halfway through a plate of funeral pasta at the reception that my cousin Danny walked in. The real Danny. Wearing a blue suit. No beard. I nearly choked on a breadstick. So now I'm sitting there, staring at blue suit Danny, real and unmistakable, as he hugs Aunt Teresa and laughs with his full, unmistakable nasal honk. Meanwhile, bearded not Danny is probably halfway across town, thinking I'm an emotionally unstable relative who really needed a hug. I excused myself from the table, muttered something about needing air, and practically sprinted to the church parking lot where we'd first talked. Gone. His ride had already come, and all I had was a number I wasn't even sure was real. I pulled out my phone and texted. Hey, this is the guy from the funeral who thought you were someone else. I owe you a very weird explanation. A few minutes later, the dots appeared, then vanished, then came back. I stared like I was watching a heart monitor. Then the message came through. I figured. You okay? That was it. No outrage. No judgment. Just you okay? And just like that, the awkwardness evaporated. I told him everything. That I was grieving. That I wasn't wearing my glasses. That I truly, sincerely thought he was my cousin. He replied. Honestly, it kind of made my day. Haven't been hugged like that in years. He said his name was Ray. He wasn't even supposed to be at that church. He'd just come to drop something off, a sound system for a friend, part-time gig. Saw the crowd, slipped in for a minute. Stayed longer because, in his words, it felt safe. Ray. A stranger I clung to in the most vulnerable moment I'd had all year. I texted back. So, funeral friends? He replied. Tuesdays. Let's make it a thing. That's how it began. Every Tuesday since, we've texted. Just a few lines. Nothing major. But every week, we've learned something new. Favorite foods. Weird family stories. I found out he once accidentally lit a microwave on fire warming up socks. He found out I have a mortal fear of squirrels. But 2 months in, one Tuesday message changed everything. Ray, can I tell you something weird? I knew Paul. I sat there blinking at my phone like it had grown teeth. What do you mean you knew Paul? I typed, heart picking up speed. Was he messing with me? This had started as a fluke, me mistaking a stranger for my cousin, and now he was telling me he actually knew my cousin? The cousin whose funeral I met him at by accident? He replied almost instantly. Ray, I wasn't close to him, but I knew who he was. He used to come into the bookstore I worked at downtown. That threw me. Paul? At a bookstore? He wasn't exactly a literary guy. Paul's idea of reading was flipping through barbecue manuals and crosswords. I replied with a skeptical really, and Ray followed up with a longer message. Yeah, it wasn't like frequent. Maybe once a month. He always asked if we had a specific poetry collection. Something by L.S. Grant. Said it was for someone he used to know. I had to sit down for that one. L.S. Grant. That was my mom's favorite poet. Paul had dated her best friend, Marie, before she moved to Colorado and ghosted the family entirely. I remembered overhearing Mom say something about him never getting closure. Never stopped looking for that one book. Was Ray serious? Had Paul really gone to that same bookstore? And if so, what were the odds that Ray would randomly walk into Paul's funeral just to drop off some audio equipment and get mistaken by me for a family member? I called him. It felt like the kind of moment that needed voice, not texts. He answered after 2 rings. His voice was warm, steady. You sound winded, he said. Are you messing with me? I blurted. No, he said gently. It freaked me out too when I saw the name on the program. I wasn't going to say anything, but then you hugged me like we'd known each other forever. I figured maybe I was supposed to be there. That last line stuck in my brain like a splinter. I figured maybe I was supposed to be there. I couldn't tell if it was fate or just really weird timing. But one thing was certain. I was no longer sure this was a simple case of mistaken identity. Ray, I said slowly. What did he say about the book? Did he ever find it? There was a pause. No, but he once left a note for someone. Told me to keep it in case she ever came in. I still have it. I didn't breathe for a solid 5 seconds. You still have the note? Yeah. Want to come get it? That Saturday, I drove across town with this ridiculous mix of nervous energy and a caffeine buzz from one too many gas station coffees. Ray lived in a small apartment over an old bakery, the kind of place that smelled permanently like burnt sugar and ghostly croissants. He met me at the door holding a manila envelope. It's not much, he said, waving it like it was a receipt. Just a scribble really, but I kept it. We sat at his tiny kitchen table, which was cluttered with coffee mugs, a succulent on its last legs, and what looked like a half-finished jigsaw puzzle of a seagull holding a hot dog. He slid the envelope across to me. It's yours. Inside was a piece of receipt paper from the bookstore. Crinkled. Folded twice. On the back, in Paul's unmistakable handwriting, was a short message. If she ever comes in, tell her I waited. L.S. Grant, page 47. That was it. No name. No punctuation. Just that. I read it 3 times before I realized I was holding my breath. She had to be Marie. Paul's long-lost almost something. And page 47? My mind was spinning. Ray pointed to a dusty shelf behind me. I actually found a used copy of L.S. Grant a few months after he stopped coming in. I still have it. Grab it if you want. The book was thin, cloth-bound, navy blue with silver lettering, quiet rivers and loud silences. I flipped quickly to page 47. The poem was titled, What We Don't Say Out Loud. It was a love poem, tentative, longing, and strangely honest. It talked about moments left unsaid, about looking for someone in every bookstore, in every hallway, in every face. It ended with a single, chilling line. Maybe one day you'll read this, and remember I was never brave enough. I didn't speak for a while. Ray didn't press me. Eventually, I said, You know this is weird, right? That I thought you were someone else. And you were connected to Paul. That's not normal. Ray gave a soft laugh and sipped his coffee. Yeah, but you ever feel like maybe life screws up on purpose? Like it mixes people up, hoping they'll find the right ones by accident. I just looked at him. That was the moment I knew. This wasn't just about mistaken identity anymore. This was about untangling a knot someone else had left behind. One note, one poem, one stranger who wasn't really a stranger anymore. And that's when Ray said, You know what's even weirder? What? I don't think Paul ever meant for that note to reach Marie. I stared at Ray like he'd just told me he was secretly royalty or allergic to gravity. What do you mean he didn't mean it for her? He shrugged, leaned back in his chair, and looked up like he was replaying a memory on the ceiling. I don't think the note was really for Marie. Or at least, not just her. The way he talked, every time he mentioned her or the book, it felt more like he was talking to himself. You know, I didn't. But I nodded anyway, because I was suddenly afraid of what he was trying to say. He was always vague. He'd say stuff like, some people don't show up when you need them, and others show up just by accident. And he always came in on the same day every month. Always sat at the same table by the window. Sometimes he didn't even buy anything. He'd just read and leave. I was quiet for a long time. Then wait. What day was that? Ray didn't hesitate. First Tuesday of every month. And just like that, I felt my spine straighten like a ruler. Ray and I had been texting every Tuesday. We started on a Tuesday. Paul visited that bookstore on Tuesdays. That's not possible, I murmured. Ray raised his eyebrows. What isn't? Paul. He always said Tuesday was his day off from everything. But I thought that just meant chores and emails. I didn't know it meant this. I held up the book. Ray leaned forward. I think he was leaving a breadcrumb trail. He just didn't know who'd follow it. For the first time, I noticed a tiny pin mark on the inside cover of the poetry book. Barely visible. Just 3 letters. RTM. Ray blinked. Wait. That's my full initials. We locked eyes. He stood up abruptly and started pacing. Okay. Hold on. I bought this book from a donation shelf. A clearance bin. There's no way he would have known I'd end up with it. Unless, I said slowly, he wanted someone to. Someone like you. Someone who'd listen. Ray sat back down, rubbed his hands together, then said the quietest thing I've ever heard across a kitchen table. Do you think Paul was trying to tell me something? I didn't answer right away. Instead, I opened the book to the first page. Not the table of contents, not the dedication, but the very first blank page. And written faintly in pencil, barely visible unless you tilted the paper toward the light, were 6 words. He'll know, just not right away. Ray stared at the words, then at me. You sure you had the wrong guy that day? He asked. And suddenly, I wasn't. I didn't leave Ray's apartment right away, not because I needed more answers, but because something in the silence between us felt more valuable than clarity. We sat there, that book resting between us like a third guest at the table, and I kept flipping through it like maybe I'd find more scribbles, more breadcrumbs. But there were no other messages, just poems, quiet and aching, and the growing sense that I had stumbled into something that wasn't mine, but had somehow become my responsibility. It's yours now, Ray said, nodding toward the book. Whatever Paul wanted to say, I think you're the one meant to hear it. I laughed a little at that, soft and tired. He left it with you. Maybe, he said. But he marked it with my initials and gave you the hug. That shut me up. Because he wasn't wrong. I left his place with the book under my arm and the kind of heaviness that doesn't feel bad, just real. It was late, maybe after midnight, and I drove home in that peculiar quiet where streetlights look softer and the world seems to whisper instead of shout. At every red light, I caught myself staring at the book on the passenger seat like it might open its mouth and explain everything. Of course, it didn't. But when I got home, I didn't toss it on a shelf or shove it in a drawer. I placed it gently on my nightstand, next to my old alarm clock and a dusty candle I'd never lit, and just stared at it until sleep pulled me under. But at 3:14 a.m., I woke up like someone had called my name. There was no sound, no nightmare, just that feeling of being summoned. So I turned on my lamp, reached for the book, and flipped straight to page 47. This time, I didn't just read it. I read it, out loud, like Paul might be somewhere listening. My voice cracked halfway through. The words weren't fancy or even particularly poetic, but they felt honest, like a confession wrapped in metaphor, like someone standing at the edge of love and fear and not quite choosing either. When I got to the last line, maybe one day you'll read this and remember I was never brave enough. I couldn't stop the tears. They weren't dramatic, just slow and steady, like a faucet that had been dripping behind a wall for years. I whispered into the quiet, "Me neither, Paul," and closed the book. And for the first time in weeks, I fell asleep without a single dream. The next morning felt strangely normal, which in itself was unsettling, like waking up after an earthquake and finding the furniture in place but the walls still humming. I made coffee, burned the toast, and stared at the book on my nightstand like it might make the next move. But it just sat there, silent and solid, while my brain replayed the night before in loops. I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just some poetic coincidence, that Paul, in his quiet and slightly chaotic way, had left a trail, and for whatever reason, I was following it. Around noon, I texted Ray. I read it last night. Page 47. Out loud. His reply came almost instantly. Did it feel like someone was listening? I didn't answer that because I wasn't ready to admit it had. Instead, I asked, do you think Paul regretted not saying more? Ray replied, I think Paul said plenty, just not out loud. That stuck with me all day. I kept thinking about all the things I hadn't said, at Paul's funeral, to Marie, even to myself. So I did something I hadn't done in years. I called Marie. I don't know what I expected, maybe a polite brush-off or a voicemail black hole, but she picked up on the second ring. Her voice hadn't changed. Still low, careful, like she was always preparing to be interrupted. I told her who I was, that I was Paul's cousin, and that I had something of his she might want to see. There was a long pause on her end. Then she said, "What is it?" I told her it was a note. About her. Written in a book of poetry. Her voice barely cracked when she asked, "Is it angry?" That hit me harder than I expected. "No," I said softly. "It's not angry. It's just unfinished." She asked to meet. We chose the bookstore, the one where Paul used to sit, where the poem had waited, where the past somehow hadn't expired. I got there early, book clutched like a fragile relic, heart thudding with the weight of someone else's memory. When she walked in, I stood. She looked older than I remembered, but not in a bad way. Her hair was streaked with gray now, and she wore a coat too big for her, but her eyes were sharp, sharp and cautious. I handed her the book without a word. She took it, sat, and flipped straight to page 47 like she already knew what to look for. When she finished, she closed the book, placed it gently on the table between us, and said, "He never said goodbye." I nodded. Maybe this was it. We didn't speak for a long time after that. But when she finally looked at me, her expression was softer. You knew him well? She asked. I smiled sadly. Not as well as I thought, but maybe enough to finish a sentence he never said. She picked up the book, ran her fingers over the spine, and said, Page 47. I won't forget. And in that moment, I knew she wouldn't. After meeting with Marie, something shifted, not dramatically, but quietly, like a chair moved half an inch or a window left slightly open. She didn't ask to keep the book, which surprised me, but she did ask if she could take a photo of page 47. I think I need to see it a few more times, she said. I nodded, and she pulled out an old phone with a cracked screen, gently positioning it above the page like it was a sacred artifact. Afterward, we stood outside the bookstore for a few minutes, not really saying goodbye, just existing beside each other in the aftermath of something delicate. Before she walked away, she said, You know, I used to write him letters. I just never sent them. I smiled. Maybe one day you still can. That made her laugh, though not in a joyful way. More like she'd just remembered the punchline to a very sad joke. I didn't watch her leave. I couldn't. I sat back down in the cafe with the book still open, sipping a lukewarm coffee I hadn't touched before, thinking about how strange it was to be part of someone else's unfinished story. Later that night, Ray called. Not a text, a full call, which felt old school in a way that made me immediately anxious and kind of warm at the same time. So he said, How did it go? She didn't cry, I said, but I think she felt it. He let out a long breath on the other end. You ever think maybe Paul didn't want anyone to cry? Maybe he just wanted to be remembered in the quiet way. I didn't respond right away. Ray, I said slowly, can I ask you something a little strange? Only if I can say something even stranger after, he replied. I smiled. Okay. Do you think it's possible Paul left that note knowing you wouldn't give it to Marie? Like, do you think he knew it'd end up with someone else? Ray went silent for a moment. Then he said, That's the same thing I've been asking myself. Because here's the weird part. I wasn't working that day. I wasn't supposed to be at the church. I just went. I thought I was dropping off gear, but it turns out the delivery had been canceled the day before. I never got the update. I sat up straight. Wait, what? Yeah, the job didn't exist. There was no event. No equipment. But I went anyway. So why did you stay? He hesitated, and when he spoke again, his voice was quieter. Because someone hugged me like I meant something. Like I was supposed to be there. I didn't know what to say to that. I felt it too. The thread, the pull, the invisible line that had yanked us both into a space neither of us had planned for. Ray cleared his throat. Okay, my turn for strange, he said. Shoot. Do you remember the book's title? Yeah, Quiet Rivers and Loud Silences. What? Look at the first letters, he said. I grabbed the book and jotted them down. QRELS, now read them out loud, he said. I did. And then I saw it. Sounds like quirrels or, wait. Keep going, Ray urged. QRELS, I whispered. Almost like Charles. My middle name, Ray said. Raymond Charles. And suddenly, it wasn't just a book anymore. It was a message layered in layers. A riddle wrapped in grief. A breadcrumb trail left for two people who hadn't even realized they were part of the story yet. I stared at the book long after Ray hung up, the letters QRELS echoing in my mind like a name spoken through water. Raymond Charles. It was either the world's weirdest coincidence or something much deeper, something intentional. I flipped the book back and forth, scanning every page for more clues like I'd stumbled into a literary escape room designed by someone who knew I couldn't resist a mystery with feelings. That night, I didn't sleep. I laid in bed thinking about the book, about Paul, about the strange geometry of people's lives intersecting when they're least expecting it. It wasn't just about grief anymore. It wasn't even about closure. It was about the idea that maybe we don't just carry stories, we become them. I texted Ray in the morning. This is going to sound unhinged, but do you think Paul knew you'd end up at that funeral? That you'd bring the book to me by accident? He replied, I think he knew someone would. And that someone would be you. That stopped me. Because that's the part that kept haunting me, not that I hugged a stranger and the stranger turned out to be connected to Paul, but that I chose Ray. Of all the people in that room, I walked up to him. Maybe it wasn't my eyes or grief or bad memory. Maybe it was instinct. Or maybe something more. That weekend, I saw Marie again. She invited me over for tea and homemade cookies that she apologized for 3 times before I took a bite. They were great, by the way. We talked more about Paul, not the sad parts, but the ridiculous ones. Like how he used to make up names for pigeons or how he once spent 3 hours writing a love letter to a woman and then accidentally emailed it to his boss. I asked her if she thought he was a romantic. She said, no. I think he was a realist who desperately wanted to be a romantic. That sounded exactly like Paul. Then she showed me something. A letter. One of the ones she'd written to him and never sent. It was short, folded neatly, and dated 4 years ago. She handed it to me and said, I think you deserve to hear this. Even now. I unfolded it and read, I still think of you when I hear wind chimes. I don't know why. Maybe it's because you never stayed still long enough for silence, and that's the only sound I could imagine you becoming. I forgave you a long time ago, but I forgot to tell you. My throat tightened. I handed the letter back carefully, as if it might dissolve in my hands. She said, do you think it's too late to forgive someone who's gone? I thought about it for a long time before answering. Only if you believe they stopped listening. She smiled sadly. Then she did something unexpected. She pulled out a small frame and slid the letter inside. I think I'm done waiting for closure, she said. Maybe I'll just create it. On the way home, I texted Ray. You ever feel like we're walking through someone else's story and they're just nudging us along? He responded, all the time. But maybe that's how we write our own, by finishing the sentences they left behind. I didn't reply. I just sat in my car with the engine off, the poetry book in my lap, and the faint sound of wind chimes somewhere in the distance, like the universe itself was exhaling. Life didn't go back to normal after that. It settled into something new, something oddly soft around the edges, like the way light looks different after a storm passes. Ray and I kept texting every Tuesday, just like we had from the beginning, but now our conversations carried the weight and warmth of something earned. Sometimes it was a single line, page 47 hit harder this week, or just saw a man who looked exactly like Paul from the back, and other times it turned into full-on therapy sessions via thumbs. One day he sent me a photo of his living room, freshly painted a deep navy blue. Same color as the book, he'd written. Didn't even plan it. I sent back a selfie with the poetry book tucked under my arm, captioned, I think it's following us. In a way, it was. Paul's presence didn't disappear, it just changed form. It moved into small rituals, the way I started reading poetry on Sunday nights, the way Marie lit a candle beside the frame that held her unsent letter, the way Ray started keeping a journal titled, Loud Silences. He told me he wasn't sure if he was writing to Paul or because of him, but it didn't seem to matter. The important part was the writing. On the third Tuesday in April, Ray texted, Hey, mind if I swing by your place? He'd never asked before. Our connection had always lived in pixels and memory. I said yes. When he arrived, he was holding something wrapped in butcher paper and tied with twine. It's not a sandwich, he joked, handing it to me. Inside was a framed print of the poem from page 47, typed on an old typewriter, with one line underlined twice in red. What we don't say out loud echoes longest. I stared at it for a long time before asking, why that line? He shrugged. Because I think it explains everything. Why you left the note. Why you found me. Why this matters. I leaned the frame against my bookshelf. It's not what I would have picked, I said honestly. But it's the one I needed. We talked for hours that night, the kind of talk you don't plan, just layer after layer of real stuff that only surfaces when people are done pretending they're okay. At some point, Ray looked at me and said, You know what the twist is in all this? I raised an eyebrow. There's a twist. He nodded. Yeah, it's that none of this would have happened if you hadn't mistaken me for someone else. I laughed, but it wasn't just laughter. It was the sound of truth arriving like a guest you'd forgotten you invited. You're saying grief has bad eyesight? No, he said. I'm saying grief has instincts. That line stuck with me. I wrote it on a sticky note the next morning and slapped it on my mirror. Grief has instincts. And for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like I was drowning in loss. I felt like I was learning a new language, one that Paul had started writing and left for the rest of us to finish, one poem, one Tuesday, one mistake-turned-miracle at a time. It was a random Tuesday when Ray texted me something that didn't seem like a big deal at first. Just 6 simple words. You sure it was a mistake? I blinked at my screen, the kind of blink you do when your brain stumbles over something that doesn't quite fit. I typed back. The hug? 100%. Thought you were Danny. But Ray responded instantly. Not that part. The part where I showed up. I stared at those words for a long time, sitting in my kitchen with half a cup of cold coffee and a sink full of dishes I wasn't planning to wash. Because here's the thing. Ray had a point. Everything about our meeting had been weirdly precise. He wasn't supposed to be at the church that day. I wasn't supposed to walk in late and overwhelmed. And yet somehow, in that chaotic moment, I reached out and hugged a stranger who turned out not to be a stranger at all. I called him instead of texting. All right, philosopher, I said when he picked up. Go ahead, hit me with it. Ray chuckled softly. I've just been thinking. What if we're so focused on who we lost that we miss who we're still finding? That's deep. I said, even though I meant it. No, I'm serious, he replied. Paul may have left a note. A poem. A mystery. But he also left us. Whatever this is. I glanced at the poetry book on my windowsill, sun curling its spine like it had aged overnight. You think Paul was matchmaking from beyond? Not matchmaking, Ray said. More like thread pulling. He tugged a string, and it led you to me. I went quiet, because it didn't feel wrong. It felt oddly comforting. That maybe the people we lose leave behind more than memories. Maybe they leave opportunities. And maybe, if we're lucky, someone shows up who doesn't quite fit, but fits enough to matter. Ray added, I don't want this to sound weird, but that Tuesday, when you hugged me, I really needed that. I'd been having a bad year. Not tragic, not headline-worthy. Just lonely. You know, I nodded, even though he couldn't see me. Yeah, I know. So I don't think you hugged the wrong person, he said. I think you hugged the right one at the wrong funeral. That made me laugh out loud. That should be the title of something, I said. A poem. A book. A rom-com with terrible lighting. Maybe it already is, he said. We just haven't written it yet. After we hung up, I stood in my hallway staring at a framed photo of Paul, him in his backyard, holding a grill spatula like a weapon and wearing an apron that said, kiss the cook or leave the party. I whispered, did you know what you were doing? The photo didn't answer, of course, but it didn't have to. I grabbed the poetry book and turned to the last page. There was nothing there, just blank paper, a clean slate. And for the first time since this whole thing started, I didn't go searching for hidden messages or initials. I just picked up a pen and wrote, in small, careful letters, not the wrong person, just a new story. And maybe that was always the point. It was nearly a year later when I found myself standing beside Ray on a patch of spring grass, just a few feet from Paul's headstone. The cemetery was quiet, birds in the distance, the faint hum of traffic too far to be real. I was holding a bouquet of sunflowers, Paul's favorite because, as he once told me, they look like optimism with stems. Ray, on the other hand, held something wrapped in wax paper. I gave him a look. Please don't tell me it's a sandwich. He smirked. Not this time. He knelt down, placed the package carefully at the base of the stone, and unwrapped it to reveal a small, hand-bound book. On the cover, embossed in gold foil, were the words Echoes Between Tuesdays. You finished it, I whispered. Yeah, he said, brushing a speck of dirt off the spine. It's not perfect, but it's ours. Inside were poems, some mine, some his, and a few fragments we'd pulled from Paul's margins. We didn't write it for publishing or praise. We wrote it because grief, when shared, becomes something softer, and stories, when finished together, become something lasting. I tucked the sunflowers beside the book and took a step back. You know, I used to think this was the strangest thing that ever happened to me, I said. Mistaking a stranger for my cousin, crying on his shoulder. And then this. You don't think that anymore? Ray asked. I shook my head. No, I think it was the most honest thing I've done in years. He smiled, and for a second, neither of us said anything. We just stood there in the soft breeze, letting the silence speak in ways words never could. As we walked back toward the car, I turned to him and said, you know what still blows my mind? What? That none of this would have happened if I'd worn my glasses. He laughed. So basically, bad vision saved both of us. Or, I said, grief had a better prescription. He groaned. That was terrible. You're welcome, I replied. We should put that on the dedication page in book 2. We're doing a book 2? Obviously. When we got into the car, I glanced once more at the grave through the window. There was something full circle about the whole thing, not wrapped in a neat bow, but gently closed, like a letter finally mailed. Ray pulled out his phone. You ready? For what? It's Tuesday, he said. Time to send the weekly text. I smiled, pulled out my phone, and typed. Still here. Still writing. Thanks for the mix-up. We sent it together, to a number that no longer connected to anything, a small message cast into the quiet, just in case Paul was still out there, somewhere, listening. And then, without ceremony or fanfare, we drove away, two unlikely friends bonded by a misstep, a poem, and the strange, beautiful logic of grief.